It was just a typical Tuesday. I'd been working overtime that week, so coming home late had become routine. My wife, Emma, was understanding, at least, I thought she was. In retrospect, maybe I was just too trusting or too naive, assuming that our quiet, stable life could never be rocked by anything as messy as infidelity. Emma and I had been married for nearly 8 years. We weren't perfect, but we were steady. The kind of couple that our friends described as meant for each other. She was a high school teacher, a career she loved, and I worked in a small but successful tech startup. We both shared a love for travel and had made a tradition of visiting new places whenever we could. Looking back, it felt like our relationship was built on shared routines and comfortable silence. Maybe that was the first sign, the quiet that seeped in over time. But I didn't notice it back then. A couple of weeks ago, my old friend Ben from college got in touch. He worked as a manager at a small boutique hotel downtown. We hadn't seen each other in ages, so when he suggested catching up over a drink at his hotel bar, I thought it was a great idea. I didn't mention it to Emma. She was out with her friends for a girls' night, something she had recently started doing more often. We were both leading busy lives, and I didn't see the harm in keeping little things to ourselves. Or maybe, on some level, I didn't want to admit to the slight chill I'd begun to feel between us. Ben was already at the bar when I arrived, a warm smile on his face. We reminisced, swapping stories from our college days, and he teased me about getting domesticated. We laughed over drinks, and he asked about Emma, recalling our wedding day like it was just yesterday. That's when he said something that caught me off guard. "Actually, I think I saw Emma here not too long ago," he said casually, pouring us another round. I remember laughing at first, thinking he was mistaken. Emma didn't know Ben personally, and as far as I knew, she rarely went to hotels unless we were traveling. She wasn't the type to hang out in hotel bars, let alone alone. "Are you sure it was her?" I asked, chuckling to mask the sudden discomfort creeping up my spine. "Pretty sure, man. She checked in with someone, actually. Thought it was weird but figured it was none of my business." There was a split second where I wanted to laugh it off, to dismiss it as a harmless mistake. But Ben's expression was dead serious. He didn't know he'd just dropped a bomb on me, or maybe he was trying to gauge my reaction. I forced a smile and told him he must have been mistaken. Still, the seed of doubt was already planted, taking root with every passing second. By the time I left the bar that night, my mind was racing. Ben's words played on repeat, echoing louder and louder until I couldn't ignore the implications. I could have asked him more, demanded details, but something in me held back, maybe out of fear of what I'd find. At home, I couldn't bring myself to confront Emma about it. I felt a strange numbness, like I was floating outside my own body. I didn't want to accuse her without proof, and yet, a part of me felt that maybe, somehow, I already knew. I found myself observing her in ways I hadn't done before, watching how often she checked her phone, noticing when she'd come home a little later than usual, or how her smile seemed to hold something back. In the days that followed, I convinced myself to let it go. After all, Emma and I had built a life together, and I trusted her, didn't I? But Ben's words lingered, a constant, gnawing presence I couldn't shake. And then, one night, I decided to check her phone. The decision to check Emma's phone wasn't easy. I wrestled with myself for days, convincing myself that I trusted her, that I was being paranoid. But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Every time I looked at her, I felt the weight of Ben's words. I told myself I was just overreacting. Maybe it really was nothing. But one night, after Emma had fallen asleep, I found myself wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The silence was thick, pressing down on me, and I could hear the soft sound of her breathing beside me. The familiar comfort I used to feel lying next to her was gone, replaced by something heavier, a feeling I couldn't name. Before I knew it, I was reaching for her phone, which was charging on her nightstand. My heart was pounding as I unlocked it. She rarely set a passcode, trusting that we didn't need such barriers between us. But as I scrolled through her messages, my hands shook, and I felt a rush of guilt. There was nothing incriminating, just casual texts with her friends and family, small snippets of her day-to-day life. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, mixed with a sense of shame for doubting her. But then, I opened her email. There, buried among work notifications and promotional messages, was a single, innocuous email from a hotel. It wasn't from Ben's hotel, this one was in a different part of town, one we'd never visited together. The subject line was simple, reservation confirmation. My blood ran cold. The email was dated the same day Ben had mentioned seeing her. I tapped on it, and the details appeared in black and white, her name, a one-night reservation, and a check-in time that aligned suspiciously with her girls' night. My mind raced with questions. Who was she meeting? Why here, in a hotel? It could be innocent, I told myself, maybe she had gone out with her friends and needed a place to crash for the night. But the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. This wasn't the kind of thing Emma would do, she was the type who'd rather take a cab home than spend the night in a random hotel. Unable to contain myself, I kept scrolling, hoping to find something that would give me a reasonable explanation. But instead, I found a chain of emails with another person, a man named L. There was no full name, just the initial, but the messages were enough to piece together a picture I'd never wanted to see. Their tone was flirtatious, their words laced with inside jokes and teasing. Some of the messages were vague, but the undercurrent was clear. There was a familiarity between them, a connection that had no place in my marriage. The last message sealed it. It was a brief email sent on the night of her hotel stay, "Can't wait to see you tonight. Room 318. I felt the ground shift beneath me. The betrayal stung in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I sat there, in the quiet of our bedroom, feeling as if I'd been punched in the gut. The weight of it was crushing, the realization settling in that the life I thought I knew had been a lie. I wanted to wake her up, to demand answers, to make her look me in the eyes and tell me the truth. But I knew that if I did, I wouldn't be able to contain the anger boiling up inside me. Instead, I put the phone back where I found it, my heart racing. I lay down beside her, listening to her steady breathing, and felt like a stranger in my own life. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every thought, every memory we'd shared, was now tinged with the knowledge of her betrayal. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I couldn't stay here, not like this. The only thing I needed was a plan. If Emma had chosen to throw away our marriage for one night in a hotel, then I would leave without looking back. After finding the damning email, I could barely look at Emma without feeling a strange mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. She was still the same person I knew, or thought I knew, but now every little gesture seemed tainted. I struggled to keep calm, pretending nothing was wrong, but every time she left the room, I felt a pang of resentment. I needed to confront her, but I wanted to do it in a way that left no room for excuses or deflections. So, I decided to reach out to Ben again, hoping he might have more details about what he'd seen. I met up with Ben the next evening, and with a bit of probing, he reluctantly admitted that he'd seen Emma arrive with a man he didn't recognize. They had checked in together, clearly familiar with one another, though he hadn't seen much beyond that. Hearing it confirmed my worst fears, and with a final, sickening sense of certainty, I knew what I had to do. I spent the next few days formulating a plan. I couldn't just confront her and risk an explosive argument. I wanted my exit to be as clean and clear as possible, leaving nothing for her to question or misunderstand. So, while Emma was at work, I began slowly packing my things, removing traces of myself from our apartment. I called a friend who agreed to let me stay at his place temporarily until I could find somewhere permanent. The hardest part was the note. I wanted it to be simple, direct, and final. After several drafts, I settled on a brief message, "I know. Goodbye. Nothing more." There was no point in dragging out explanations when she knew exactly what she'd done. The day I finally made my decision was filled with heavy silence. I carefully packed my things, taking my time, carefully folding each item, things that had witnessed our life together, memories that I once cherished. I looked at the photo of us together on the wall, at the places where we spent our evenings, talked about our dreams, discussed our plans. All this now seemed like a shadow, a treacherous illusion. I prepared everything for her return. I left only furniture in the empty house, but nowhere was there a single thing of mine that would remind her that I had once lived here. I wanted her to feel this emptiness the way I felt it when I learned the truth. Minutes seemed like long hours as I wrote a short farewell message, putting the silence and disappointment that had long been building up inside me into every word. In the note, I wrote a simple statement: I know. Goodbye. Finally, I left the key on the table, took one last look at the apartment, and left, closing the door behind me. I could almost hear the silence engulfing the room, the silence that would now become its new reality. I went downstairs, out into the street, where a new life awaited me, full of uncertainty, but at least without lies. The feeling of relief was intertwined with pain, but it was my own choice now, the choice to leave the past behind. That night, as I lay on my friend's couch, I felt an odd sense of peace. The anguish and anger had subsided, replaced by a hollow calm. I had no regrets about my decision, I'd done what I had to do. But now, in the quiet of my new surroundings, I wondered what Emma's reaction would be. Did she regret her actions? Did she even think of me, or was I just an afterthought in her pursuit of something new? Emma's call came late that night. I'd expected it, but seeing her name on my screen still sent a wave of bitterness through me. I let it ring. Then she called again. And again. Texts started coming in, a flurry of messages that went from confusion to anger to pleading. I didn't respond to any of them, and eventually, her calls stopped. I knew she was left with nothing but the empty apartment and the 2 words I'd left behind. The next day, her messages took a different tone. She asked me to talk, to explain, saying she didn't understand what was going on. She claimed innocence, acting as if nothing had happened. The feigned confusion only made me angrier, as if she thought I hadn't seen right through her deception. I still said nothing, letting her words hang in the digital void, unanswered. Days passed, and Emma's messages shifted again, this time taking on a more desperate, apologetic tone. She admitted to making a mistake, saying it had been a one-time thing, a lapse in judgment. She begged me to come back, to forgive her, promising it would never happen again. But her words felt hollow, each message reopening the wound she'd left. As the days turned into weeks, mutual friends began reaching out, asking why I'd left so suddenly, and whether everything was okay. I kept my answers vague, not wanting to drag others into the mess. But it was clear that Emma had started talking, spreading her own version of events. I wondered what story she was telling, and whether she was trying to cast herself as the victim. Eventually, word reached my family, who were blindsided by the sudden separation. I had to explain, as calmly as possible, what had happened. My parents were supportive, if heartbroken, while my siblings offered a mix of anger and empathy. Telling them made it all feel painfully real, the finality of it settling in as I recounted the betrayal. One evening, as I was finally settling into some semblance of routine at my friend's place, there was a knock at the door. My friend was out for the night, so I assumed it was a delivery. But when I opened the door, I was greeted by a sight that sent a wave of resentment and exhaustion through me: Emma, standing on the doorstep, looking uncharacteristically vulnerable. Her face was a picture of regret. Dark circles under her eyes hinted at sleepless nights, and her posture, slumped, shoulders drawn in, was so unlike her usual confidence that, for a moment, I almost pitied her. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes, lips trembling as she spoke. "Please, just let me explain." I held the door frame, leaning against it, feeling the same detachment that had kept me grounded over the past weeks. Part of me wanted to slam the door and let her deal with her guilt on her own, but another part, the part that had loved her deeply, was too tired to turn away. "Go ahead, explain," I said, my voice flat, almost a whisper. She seemed taken aback by my calm, as if expecting me to unleash the anger I'd been holding in. Instead, I watched as she fumbled for words, her gaze shifting as she fought to find an excuse for the inexcusable. It was just one time," she stammered. "I was lost, and things have been so complicated between us lately. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Her words faltered, and she seemed to crumble in front of me, covering her face with her hands. "Please, just come home. We can work through this. I promise I'll do whatever it takes." I let her words hang in the air, the weight of her pleading pressing against the barrier between us. She had taken something precious and shattered it. A promise meant to be unbreakable, fractured by her own choices. I could see she was drowning in regret, but as I looked at her, I felt only an empty acceptance. "You made your choice, Emma," I replied, voice calm but final. "And I've made mine." I stepped back and closed the door, leaving her on the other side with her apologies and her regret. It was the last time I saw her. After that confrontation, I felt a strange relief, as though a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. I blocked her number, changed my email, and let our mutual friends know I needed space. I'd spent years building a life with her, but now, it was time to build something for myself. I focused on work, accepted extra projects to keep busy, and even started a new hobby, photography. I wasn't very good at it, but it gave me a reason to explore new places, to see life through a different lens, literally and figuratively. Friends and family rallied around me. My sister, who'd always been perceptive, called often to check in, sometimes sending over a homemade meal or small gift as a reminder that I wasn't alone. My parents, though devastated, offered quiet support, understanding that I needed to work through this on my own terms. There were still days when I'd wake up and forget, only for the reality to hit again like a punch to the gut. Yet, slowly, I was beginning to reclaim parts of myself that had been buried in the routines and compromises of marriage. As weeks turned into months, I found myself reflecting on my time with Emma. There was anger, of course, resentment over her betrayal and how effortlessly she'd upended our lives. But in the silence of my new space, I began to see the cracks that had existed long before that fateful night in the hotel. There were small moments of discontent, conversations left unfinished, gestures taken for granted. In our pursuit of comfort, we'd both neglected the very thing that had brought us together. Through therapy, I started examining my own role, recognizing patterns that I hadn't wanted to see before. I had become complacent, relying on routine rather than real connection. Emma's betrayal was her choice, but our marriage's quiet unraveling was the result of both our actions and inactions. It was a painful realization, but one that brought a sense of closure. I was no longer carrying the weight of anger. I could look back on my years with her as a lesson, albeit a costly one. Slowly, I allowed myself to trust again, not in others just yet, but in myself. I began to rebuild my confidence, reconnecting with passions I'd set aside for the sake of us. I took up hiking, started volunteering, and even considered going back to school for a certification I'd once dreamed of. Each new endeavor was a step away from the past, a declaration that I could, and would, move forward. Eventually, I found a small apartment of my own. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a blank canvas where I could start anew. The first night I spent there, the quiet was almost overwhelming, each echo reminding me of how drastically my life had changed. But as I looked around, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, peace. On a whim, I bought some second-hand furniture, things that didn't hold any history or memories, just simple comforts that felt like a fresh start. I hung up some of my favorite photos from my recent hikes, each one a reminder of how far I'd come. Friends came by to celebrate, filling the space with laughter and warmth, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of happiness that was entirely my own. One night, as I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I found myself grateful. Grateful not for the heartbreak or betrayal, but for the journey I'd been forced to take. I'd survived, rebuilt, and in doing so, rediscovered parts of myself I hadn't known were missing. I wasn't the same person who had stood in that empty apartment weeks ago, leaving a note on the table. I was stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever lay ahead. In the stillness of that moment, I realized I no longer needed closure from Emma. My peace was enough, and it was more than she could ever take away.